been a while, but welcome to another episode of A Century of Lights. One of the points I've been trying to make with this webcast is that a lot has changed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Some are obvious, some not so obvious. One such obvious thing is that we somehow wound up with a Western world where you can no longer be tortured and burned alive for having the wrong religious opinions. Of course, religious persecution and bigotry are still around, as anyone living through 2016 knows. But generally, in Europe and the Americas, the government won't try to lock you up because you believe in the wrong sect of Protestantism, or you believe in the old pagan gods, or you believe in no God at all. How did all of this come about? Well, for starters, the meaning of religion in people's lives changed completely starting in the 16th century. Today, for most believers, except the most devout, church is mostly just a place you go once, maybe twice a week, and if you're lucky, you get to have some free cookies and coffee after services. But it is also very much community. Yet in the modern world, it is just one of several communities you can take or leave or trade in for another. Except in probably the most rural of areas or among secluded religious communities like ultra-Orthodox Jews or the Amish, it's not likely to be something that will have an immutable sway in your life, unlike other communities and identities like your government or your family or even your school or even your workplace. Back in medieval Europe, church meant a lot more. It was the main provider of welfare, and it was where you and your kids got their education, and it was even the source of news since priests often included news in their sermons. The churches organized the closest thing to public schools, and even private tutors tended to be clerics or monks. And it was the church that, with money gained through mandatory tithes, established and funded hospitals, orphanages, and even retirement homes. Yes, they had those in the Middle Ages. This is why it was such a big deal when the church spent its money on a decked out cathedral in Rome or an expansion on an archbishop's palace. It wasn't just it wasn't just a betrayal of Jesus Christ's whole go and sell what you own thing, but was spending money that otherwise might have gone to a hospital for beggars. The bottom line is that in the Middle Ages, the church used to play a part in people's lives that's now been mostly taken over by the government or by private agencies. This is why, before the 17th and 18th centuries, talking about the separation of church and state, or talking about making religion a purely private affair, would have been like asking what the sound of blue is. That might help explain why a monk named Martin Luther, also known as that drunken German to Pope Leo X, managed to get so much press. However, even before Luther came along, the old system was already changing. Europe's population boom was straining the church's resources, and scholars were beginning to write out detailed plans for governments to start funding and providing welfare, with one 16th century scholar, Johann Louis Vives, laying down the plans for the first job training program in history. So once you end up with a church that can't keep up with all the needy people anymore, the second key ingredient you need for your religious revolution is print. I've said it before and I'll probably say it again, but you couldn't have had the Reformation without the printed word any more than you can have flame wars without the internet. It made it much easier to spread criticisms of the church, as well as so-called heresies, and it all made it so much harder for authorities to stop them. True, some medieval heresies were pretty successful, but they tended to be isolated to regions where they had to be spread by word of mouth and needed protection from networks of powerful locals. Thanks to the Pope busting printing press, heresy could really go viral, and all it needed was for some books to get picked up by printing presses here and there. A priest in Scotland could pick up a copy of one of Martin Luther's books, originally published in Saxony, 1,000 miles away, and come to the conclusion that the Pope might actually be the Antichrist. Different places in the 16th century tried containment in different ways. Some places, like Spain and parts of Italy, kept doing it the old fashioned hardcore way, outlawing books and burning heretics. England under Queen Elizabeth I wouldn't really ever try to catch you having the wrong religious beliefs, unlike the Spanish Inquisition. You just had to go to the government approved church every Sunday or end up with a hefty fine. This was what was considered progressive and tolerant at the time. But in the second half of the 16th century, Transylvania, yes, that Transylvania, and Poland both gave their subjects full religious freedom. In fact, Transylvania was the birthplace of Unitarianism, which in turn spawned Unitarian Universalism. Of course, people are still more likely to associate Transylvania with Dracula rather than Unitarians, for better or for worse. In Western Europe, there was one haven of religious tolerance, the Dutch Republic. Even though the Dutch Republic was founded through a long and gruesome rebellion by Calvinist Protestants against the fanatically Catholic Spanish monarchy, it ended up giving personal freedom to Jews, Protestants, and Catholics. In fact, the Dutch Republic, a tiny and very urban country that depended on trade, found that tolerance made for very good business. An English visitor in the 16th century also noted with disgust that the Dutch exhibited their religious identities like they wore fashionable articles of clothing. In other words, it was like the English visitor got a peek into the 20th century West. But England was the place to go if you really wanted to catch some really weird and exotic forms of Christianity. The execution of King Charles I and the monarchy's replacement by a Puritan military dictatorship poorly disguised as a republic popped the cork on religious revolt. Suddenly, everyone who seemed to have access to a printing press or had a knack for public speaking was starting their own religious sect. There were the ranters who believed God was in everything and that people should listen to their own conscience rather than any church or preacher, and were rumored to have gone around naked and enjoyed orgies. If that's a little risque for you, you could sign up with the diggers, who preached that people needed to go back to the land and that the very concept of private property led to corruption. Perhaps the most notorious of all were the Quakers, who had no priesthood at all, and, most horrifying, allowed women to speak on religious topics. The monarchy did come back in 1660. While the Puritans dwindled away, the other nonconformists, which was the official government term for Protestants who refused to join the official Church of England, just kept multiplying. This was despite the fact that, unlike the Dutch Republic or Transylvania, nonconformists actually were, until 1779, discriminated against by law. They had to have a license to preach, were barred from political offices, and could not receive a university degree. Maybe it was the fact that England had very little state censorship, especially compared to heavy-handed Spain or France, or maybe the experience of a radical revolution in the 17th century had just knocked something loose. Either way, many people felt nonconformity was worth the price. One of my own favorite nonconformist groups to emerge from the woodwork was the Muggletonians. It's enough that their name is so much fun to say, but there's more to them. The sect was founded by two tailors, Ludowick Muggleton and his less delightfully named cousin John Reeve, in 1652. They claimed they were the last witnesses to God's word. Even next to the Quakers and the Ranters, the Muggletonians were just very, very odd. They refused to actually try to convert people. They hated the thought of having formal churches or any kind of clergy. They believed that God would stay out of human affairs until the end of time. They believed that heaven was just 6 miles above the earth, and they limited their religious practice to basically conversations over coffee or singing over ale at a tavern. They are also famous for cursing haters. This reputation started when a man who physically attacked Lodowick Muggleton was found dead weeks later after Lodowick had cursed him. That's not to say that they didn't like to pick fights. Lodowick and John, who loathed the Quakers for reasons I haven't been able to find, published a pamphlet titled The Neck of the Quakers Broken, or Cut in Sunder by the Two-Edged Sword of the Spirit which is put into my mouth, where Muggleton accuses Quakers of believing that the Holy Spirit caused them to foam at the mouth and sigh and groan and howl. A Muggletonian curse was even said to have killed the Scottish novelist Sir Walter Scott, who did die under mysterious circumstances after he mocked the Muggletonians in one of his novels. Sadly, even in an era that lets obscure groups find converts easier than ever, there are no Muggletonians today. Not as far as most people know, anyway. Officially, the last was Philip Nooks from Matfield, Kent, who died in 1979 and passed the official records of the entire Muggletonian sect on to the British Library. More influential but just as unorthodox was Emanuel Swedenborg, the heir to a wealthy mining dynasty in Sweden who was born in 1688. Emanuel took being an unconventional Protestant to the next level. He didn't claim, like some groups, that the Last Judgment was imminent. It already happened, actually, in 1757 to be exact, the same year the mystic poet William Blake was born, in what I hope wasn't a coincidence. It's just that only Swedenborg happened to notice, because it took place entirely on the spiritual plane that only he could see. Swedenborg could take trips to the spiritual realm in the afterlife whenever he wanted, and had conversations with angels. Now, Swedenborg wasn't really the first Christian to make claims like that. Being an occultist and being a Christian were by no means incompatible for many centuries. There were plenty of people like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's official magician, who claimed he knew the language and alphabet used by the angels. However, Swedenborg was probably the first to really make an entirely new theology out of such claims. If you read Swedenborg, especially his two books, True Christianity and Heaven and Hell, you'll see Swedenborg casually discussing theological opinions that might not seem all that radical at first, and then suddenly, poof, he's in the spirit world and gets into a debate with two or three recently deceased souls over a topic like whether or not God directly controls the day-to-day natural occurrences in the universe. In Swedenborg's own words, once, when I was having a conversation with angels, there were several people present who had recently arrived from the physical world. When I saw them, I wished them a happy arrival, and told them a number of things that they would not have otherwise known about the spiritual world. If that sounds a little new agey, even by today's standards, well, yeah, you're not wrong. Here is a bit of theology from True Christianity. The spiritual world has a sun that is pure love from Jehovah God, who is within that sun. The heat from that sun is essentially love, and its light is essentially wisdom. God is love itself, and wisdom itself, and life itself. You can easily imagine a version of that last bit alongside a coexist bumper sticker. Swedenborg explained the actual laws and geography of the afterlife in heaven and hell. When we die, according to Swedenborg, we enter into a kind of limbo. After a period in limbo, the real self of each person is revealed and they go to heaven or hell accordingly. People who live according to love and faith, regardless of their actual religion, eventually end up in heaven. In fact, Swedenborg says you only need to lead a civic and moral life. And, in his own words, who can't lead a civic and moral life? Heaven is basically getting so much joy and peace that you might not actually be able to stand it, at least not until you're ready. Meanwhile, hell is for those whose love is carnal and worldly, without any heavenly and spiritual dimension. You aren't sent to hell. Instead, how you lived and your spiritual condition draws you away from God and heaven and into hell. Swedenborg envisions hell as one big metaphor for spiritual bondage, but like all great writers of the afterlife, he can't help but go into grotesque detail. Liars and conspirators live in dark cellars. People who preached church doctrines but didn't believe in them end up living on rock piles. And people who love all the material pleasures like food and sex will in the afterlife find that they love feces and latrines and find them delightful. But in spite of Swedenborg's own little scatological spin on fire and brimstone, he seems to genuinely believe most people, if not everyone sooner or later, will end up in heaven. In his own words, we know from the Word that the Lord intends the salvation of all and the damnation of no one. Heaven and hell weren't places of reward or punishment. Nor for Swedenborg is God's love tempered by such Christian adages like God hates sin or we are unworthy of God's forgiveness. You might say that instead of being places, for Swedenborg, heaven and hell are instead states of mind. Of course, Swedenborg may sound a bit extreme, maybe even to non-Christians who are aware of the idea that everyone eventually goes to heaven, and the fact that that idea has been hotly debated since the days of ancient Rome. Even so, his influence appears in the strangest of places. Besides the fact that there is a Swedenborgian church that exists even today, William Blake was a big, if sometimes critical, fan. In fact, the only church he is known to have attended was the Swedenborgian church. Even C.S. Lewis, one of the most quoted Orthodox Christians there are, said in his book The Great Divorce that hell is a self-choice where people are stuck with their loneliness, angers, hatreds, envies, and itchings. It's a description Swedenborg might have approved of, even if we can be more sure that C.S. Lewis would have probably not have approved of Swedenborg. Even by Swedenborg's time, both Protestant and Catholic sermons were inching away from focusing on the devil and the eternal flames of hell. But Swedenborg's insistence on love as the nature of God and the true path to heaven seems more like something out of 21st century liberal Christianity than anything that's from the 18th century. You might also catch glimpses of Swedenborg in the works of modern occultists like Helena Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, particularly in his descriptions of higher metaphysical realities and high-concept spiritual ideas like his belief that angels have no concept of space or time. Swedenborg's head might have been in the spiritual world, but there was something a little more worldly to his influence too. Two Swedenborgians, C.B. Wadstrom and August Nordenskjöld from Finland and Sweden respectively, published in 1792 a pamphlet with the usual pompous 18th century title, Plan for a Free Community upon the Coast of Africa, under the protection of Great Britain, but entirely independent of all European laws and governments. It was a plan to get international funding for a colony in Sierra Leone, independent but defended by the British military, where whites and blacks could coexist and love and sex would be shared freely, all according to their own interpretation of Swedenborgian principles. It never amounted to anything, but who knows? Maybe history came close to giving us a world where Swedenborgian Christianity would have had more influence and inspired a racial equality movement and a sexual revolution almost 2 centuries later. What we can say in our world is that Swedenborg, who, if he had been born 2 centuries earlier, or perhaps even just 1 century earlier, would have been persecuted or even killed for his beliefs, could thrive in the new world that was being created in his time. Next time, join us as we talk about another religious radical, this time from the Jewish faith.